All right, in this talk, I'm going to cover the story of the discovery of the mechanism, the history of the scholarship on it, the various technologies used to study it, and of course, its many functions. When the talk is through, in groups of 8, you'll be able to see the 3D replica of the mechanism constructed from CT scans made of it in 2005. There'll be some snacks and coffee and stuff like that as well. So let's get right to it. Okay. Around 70 to 60 BCE, a large cargo ship loaded with precious goods sank off the coast of the sparsely populated islet of Antikythera. 2,000 years later, around Greek Easter of 1900, Greek sponge divers from Symi, and in particular Elias Lykopantis, discovered the shipwreck and months later reported it to the Greek authorities in Athens. An expedition was organized using early diving bell suits like the one seen here, and between November of 1900 and September of 1901, the shipwreck was salvaged under extremely adverse conditions, the first archaeological expedition of its kind, and the goods were deposited in the National Museum in Athens, where they still reside to this day. The items discovered included fine marble statues, fine bronze statues, fine glass, pottery, amphorae, and a curious device now known to the world as the Antikythera Mechanism, so named after the island in whose waters it was found. So what was the Antikythera Mechanism? As we now know, after 125 years of study, the Antikythera Mechanism was a highly sophisticated, portable geared astronomical cosmos that calculated and visualized the position of the sun, moon, including the moon's anomalous motion, and also the 5 visible planets with respect to the zodiac according to a pre-Copernican geocentric model of the cosmos, most commonly associated with the 2nd century AD astronomer Ptolemy. It also described a set of eclipse possibilities using the Saros and the Exeligmos cycles. It had a dial that indicated 6 Pan-Hellenic athletic games in chronological order in a 4-year period that was similar, but not identical to an Olympiad. It also visualized and tracked a lunar solar calendar of some Greek state based on the Metonic cycle, and almost certainly also the Calippic cycle. All these terms I'll define in a moment. It kept track of the solstices and equinoxes and a series of morning and evening risings and settings of various stars or star groups by means of what is called a Parapegma, with the events keyed to the zodiac dial, next to which it also had a movable Egyptian calendar scale to better keep track of the count of days. And finally, it also had 2 extensive inscribed product manuals, part of one I show here, known as the front cover inscription, that laid out the theory behind the planet's epicyclic movement. Alas, it could not transport you back in time, as the latest Indiana Jones movie suggests. After the mechanism was salvaged, probably in early August of 1901, its bronze fragments were apparently thrown in a bronze sorting pile in the National Museum, where they lay unremarked while all the bronze statues got all the attention. But in May of 1902, Spiridon Stais, the former Minister of Education, who was instrumental in organizing the archaeological expedition, while visiting the museum, is said to have noticed that there was writing on some of the fragments, and an expert epigrapher named Wilhelm shortly thereafter was invited to give his opinion on the date of the writing and to read what he could. He dated the writing to the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, and he detected the words Heliou Actina, or ray of sun. This immediately led one numismatic scholar named Sphoronos, who was planning a complete publication of the Antikythera finds under the pseudo-umbrella of the National Museum, to declare it was an astrolabe, a device used by mariners to ascertain latitude and the position of the sun by using the rays of the sun. Sphoronos found an ally in a historian of naval science and sub-lieutenant in the Greek Navy named Rediadis. The view of both men, however, was opposed by a professor of nautical archaeology and history named Rados, who rightly noted the gears were too complex for an astrolabe. Initially, Rados suggested it may have been a nautical hodometer, a device used for measuring the distance a ship has traveled. he would later give that idea up. This set off a dueling set of articles in local Athenian newspapers between these two groups of scholars as to whether it was an astrolabe or something else. In any case, the initial examination of the ship's finds led a group of archaeologists in February of 1903 to declare the ship's contents dated to the 2nd or 1st century BCE. But Sphorenos was undeterred, so he had Rethiathus publish the mechanism in 1903 as an astrolabe. He also ignored Wilhelm's date of the writing and the Greek archaeological community's dating of the cargo, and he put it later during the time of Constantine the Great, or 306 to 337 of our era. And he even presumed to argue that the boat was coming from Byzantium and was loaded with statues whose origin was Argos. This is a good time to talk about the date of the shipwreck. In the 1950s and 60s, a group of scholars called the Weinberg Group, and around 2010, various scholars tasked by the National Museum at Athens, have endeavored to date the shipwreck more precisely by looking at the everyday contents recovered from it. Based upon the content shown in this slide, particularly the coins, we can say with high confidence the shipwreck dates to about 70 to 60 BCE. From this, we can also say the ship almost certainly originated along the coast of Asia Minor. The logical candidates are Pergamon, Ephesus, Kos, or Rhodes, which you can see all of them on the map here. So Pergamum, Ephesus, Kos, and Rhodes. And the ship was likely on its way to Rome to sell the goods, with a probable stop-off point in northwest Greece. In a moment, we'll see some evidence tying it to both Rhodes and Epirus in northwest Greece. Epirus being in northwest Greece, not Rhodes. Back to 1903, from 1903 to 1905, a specialist in preserving bronze named Othanusopoulos began the delicate task of cleaning and separating the various fragments. This allowed a German scholar named Rehm, who was an expert in astronomy and epigraphy, to read more of the inscriptions. And in 1906, he was the first to speculate that the mechanism was a kind of planetarium. He identified some numbers on what is now called fragment 19 as referring to important periods in Greek astronomy, but a lack of technology to peer inside and advancements in his career resulted in him never having time to publish his notes, which can still be consulted at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek München. In 1934, a quirky publication by Theophanides made no real contributions, although he was the first to realize that the number of teeth on the gears played an important role in interpreting the device, and he even made a working model that still exists. During World War II, the mechanism went into storage, but in the 1950s, it was brought back out, cleaned, and rephotographed, and a historian of technology and science named Dirk de Sola Price was allowed to study it in person. This resulted in him being the first to assemble the three major fragments into their correct positions. This finally gave us an idea of what it looked like. Later, in the 1960s, he was able to make use of more modern X-rays taken by Charalambos Karakulis to count the gear tooths and offer a model of the gear trains. And with the help of the trained Greek epigrapher George Stamiris, he was also the first to publish in 1974 the significance of the references to the numbers 76, 19, and 223 on fragment 19, which Rehm had recognized long before but never published. These numbers are extremely important numbers in the study of ancient Babylonian and Greek astronomy and lunar solar calendars in general, for 76 is the number of years in a Ecliptic cycle, 19 the number of years in the Metonic cycle, and 223 the number of months in a Saros cycle. At first, Price believed the device may have been a kind of planetarium, but in the end, based upon the evidence before him, he argued that the Antikythera mechanism was only an ancient computer that calculated these astronomical periods, which again I'll define in a moment. After Price in 1985, at a lecture at the Royal Institute of Great Britain, a mathematician named Christopher Zeeman noted that Price's reconstruction of the gear trains, quote, involves a substantial step-up mechanism. It is like trying to alter a clock by pushing the hour hand and expecting this to drive the minute hand 12 times as fast, unquote. This piqued the interest of Michael Wright and Alan Bromley, who teamed up and were able to take more advanced linear tomography X-rays of the mechanism. But Bromley would pass away before he could make much use of them. The work was carried on by Wright, an expert on history of technology, especially clock-like devices, and a tinkerer himself. Through his work, he was able to improve on Price's theories and models, and he established the mechanism had a metonic calendar output. He also argued it was a planetarium. That is, it displayed the movements of the sun, the moon, and he argued the planets. He also argued the movements of both the sun and the moon could have moved according to the theories of Hipparchus, the 2nd century BCE Greek astronomer who recognized that both the sun and the moon moved in anomalous ways. And he also recognized the mechanism had a moon ball. That is, it had a ball probably painted half black and half white that displayed the phases of the moon. And if all that were not enough, he has even built models by hand using the tools and techniques the ancients would have used. Then in 2005, an interdisciplinary group known as the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, hereafter AMRP, they applied 2 newer technologies to the study of this remarkable device, which now consists of the 82 fragments of various sizes displayed here. These newer technologies include Hewlett-Packard's Polynomial Texture Mapping, now more commonly known as Reflectance Transformation Imaging, or RTI, which consists in taking several digital pictures of the fragments with lighting at various angles. Then using a computer program to manipulate the angle at which the light hits the surface, thus helping especially to read the inscriptions inscribed on the surface. And so in order to read inscriptions, you have to have sharp raking light. More important than PTMs is a technology called Micro-Focus X-Ray Computed Tomography, which allows one to create exact 3D models of the inner parts of the mechanism, so accurate that you can even read inscriptions inscribed on the inner surfaces that had not been seen in over 2,000 years. A powerful computer program called Volume Graphics Studio Max, and there are others now besides that, was also employed that allows one to make exact 3D measurements. With these technologies, combined with good old-fashioned mathematical analysis, these allow for one to accurately estimate how many teeth only partially preserved gears had, and with this knowledge, firmer theories about the function in the gears and thus the mechanism as a whole. In 2006, members of the AMRP, in a seminal article, established that the lower dial on the back face of the device described a series of eclipses using the Saros cycle, a period of 223 lunar months, first recognized by the Babylonians as early as the 8th or 7th century BCE as being useful to ascertain recurring solar and lunar eclipse possibilities, thus confirming one of Price's hypotheses. The eclipse possibilities are referenced via a series of highly abbreviated inscriptions referred to in the literature as glyphs, inscribed within some of the 223 individual cells, each which represents a synodic lunar month, that make up what is now known as the Saros dial, located on the lower back of the Antikythera mechanism. Within the Saros dial, there is also a small circular exeligmos dial, and its scale, divided into 3 sectors, entirely extant. The exeligmos represents a triple Saros period that is more accurate than the Saros. Let's see. In this article, these scholars also established that the upper dial featured a calendar output that was regulated according to the metonic cycle of 235 lunar months, which was nearly equivalent to 19 years, confirming a hypothesis of Wright. In 2008, members of the AMRP, which now included Alexander Jones and John Steele, published a second paper in which they revealed and explicated the calendar in the upper dial known as the metonic spiral. Here they demonstrated that within each of these 235 cells was inscribed the name of a month from a particular calendar, which they correctly identified as belonging to the Corinthian family of calendars, and they thought including possibly to Syracuse, a colony of Corinth, and the home of Archimedes, who tradition states built similar devices. They also suggested its first month, Phoenikaios, began shortly after the first new moon after the autumn equinox. They also identified it had a games dial listing 6 different games, the last of which they could not read. Let me quickly, let me quickly explain. I guess I left off a slide here, but in that last set of games, those are the Haliea games of Rhodes, and I was the one that made that reading of those games eventually. Okay, and that's going to be important for later on. Okay, all right. Let me quickly explain the logic of lunar solar calendars. First of all, Greek months were lunar. That is, they closely tracked the phases of the moon, with the first crescent moon ideally the first of the month, the full moon around the middle or 15th of the month, and the new moon, that is when you can see no moon, the last day of the month at conjunction. In addition, almost all Greek months were named after an important religious festival that occurred in them. So, for instance, the month of Carneus at Sparta and other Doric city-states was the month in which the Carnea festival took place in honor of Apollo. These festivals were tied to specific seasons, and it was thought very important that the gods get their sacrifices in due time. The trick of any good lunar solar calendar, then, was to find an integer number of days, an integer number of lunar months, and an integer number of tropical years arranged to keep specific lunar months tied to specific seasons when these sacrifices were due. The problem is that lunar months vary from about up to 7 hours from their mean every month. But over time, it was understood they average about 29.53 days, which is not an integer. But it is close to 29.5. So if you multiply that by 2, you get the integer of 59. So generally, lunar solar calendars alternate between months of 30 and 29 days. But if you have 12 such months, they only add up to 354 days, about 11 1/4 days shy of a solar year of 365 1/4 days. And that means that, within 3 years, your calendar will be off by an entire month, if you just keep going through. It also happens to be the case that 235 lunar months is nearly equivalent to 19 tropical years, which is 6,940 days, off by less than 2 hours. So this is the magic period where one can find an integer number of days nearly equivalent to an integer number of lunar months that is nearly equivalent to an integer number of tropical years. But 19 years times 12 months of the regular calendar equals only 228, not 235. It is thus short by 7 lunar months. So what lunar solar calendars do is insert or intercalate an extra 7 lunar months at regular intervals over 19 years. That is, if you have months alternating between 30 and 29 days, and you insert 7 extra lunar months in at regularly spaced out intervals throughout 19 years, you will have a calendar that both tracks the phases of the moon, so that the first of the month is at around first crescent, the middle of the month around full moon, and the last day of the month at conjunction, or the new moon when no moon is visible. And you will also keep these months tethered as closely as possible to specific seasons. This is the Metonic cycle, so named after Meton of Athens, who is said to have announced its discovery in Athens in 432 BCE, although we know the Babylonians were already using this by about 500 BCE to regulate their calendar. By the way, this is what the traditional Jewish and Chinese calendars still do today. But if you follow strictly the Metonic cycle, this implies years of 365 and 5/19 days, a tad too much. So in 332 BCE, an astronomer at Athens named Callippus noted that after every 4 Metonic cycles of 76 years, 1 day should be removed to make years equal to 365¼ days. This is known as the Calippic cycle. And since that inscription I mentioned earlier on the mechanism mentions the figure of 76 right next to 19, we can be pretty certain the mechanism also employed the Calippic cycle and had a Calippic dial, but this is now lost to the left side of the dial. Let's talk a bit about the calendar that is found on the mechanism, specifically to what city did this calendar belong. Naturally, this evidence also might impact arguments about where the mechanism was constructed or for whom. As members of the AMRP recognized, these months seem to have been present in the calendars of Corinth, Corinthian colonies in northwest Greece, and in the calendar of Epirus, also located in northwest Greece, as this slide shows. In the next slide, we'll see that there's more evidence found on the mechanism itself that ties it to Epirus. So this is the preferred choice. The AMRP also speculated that since this calendar could have originated in Corinth, and since Syracuse was a colony of Corinth, the calendar could also be that of Syracuse, the home of Archimedes, who, again, ancient sources say built an orrery similar to the mechanism, but about whose calendar little is directly known. However, I examined the evidence of Syracuse's calendar closely and the calendars of its colonies and nearby military outposts within its territory, such as Acrae, and it is clear that the calendar cannot be that of Syracuse. This is somewhat disappointing, as the connection of the mechanism with Syracuse, the home of Archimedes, was such a good story, obviously irresistible to the creators of the latest Indiana Jones movie, but it turns out to be wrong, and in a moment, I'll give more positive evidence that ties the mechanism directly to another known astronomical center in the world. All right, this is where this slide is. Okay, so in 2008, the MRP also identified the games dial, which they called the Olympiad dial, but it does not track Olympiads. So as Alexander Jones suggested to me, I will call it the games dial. This lists 6 religious festivals at which athletic events took place, seemingly in chronological order, including the 4 most important sets of games in antiquity: the Isthmia on the isthmus near Corinth, the Olympia at Elis, the Nemea at Nemea Argos in the Peloponnesus, and the Pythia at Delphi. The other 2 games are the Na of Dodona and Epirus, and one set of games the MRP, as it was comprised in 2008, could not decipher. And I was very interested in what these games were that were missing, and using the 2005 data, I was able to decipher the last set of games as the Haliea of Rhodes, which a Pindaric scholiast tells us finished 6 days after the Nemea, thus adding more evidence that the games were listed in chronological order. These games are also important because Rhodes had long been thought of as the most likely place where the mechanism was built, prior to some of the people in the AMRP, like people like Graham and so forth. They thought it was Rhodes. And this reading, and also Price, and this reading finally presented evidence that directly tied the mechanism there, even though, as you can see on this map, that geographically Rhodes is far distant from the other games on the mechanism. Note, too, that the spelling Haliea with an alpha, we can go back there, with an alpha, the alpha is right there. The spelling there with an alpha is the only word on the mechanism spelled in the manner of the Doric dialect. The other odd set of games were the very minor Naa of Dodona in Epirus, the same geographical area where the calendar was in use. I have thus theorized that the mechanism was built on Rhodes for a client in Epirus. The friend of Cicero, Atticus, would be the kind of person who had property in Epirus at the time of the shipwreck and who would conceivably want a device like this. Not that I'm saying it was for him or anything, but all right. Now we turn to the lower dial on the back. In 2006, members of the AMRP, in their seminal article, established that the lower dial on the back face of the device consisted of 223 cells, each representing a lunar month that described a series of eclipse possibilities using the Saros cycle. That period of 223 lunar months, first recognized by the Babylonians by the 7th century BC at the latest as being useful to ascertain recurring solar and lunar eclipse possibilities. Here is how it worked. As the pointer of the upper dial pointed to a cell with a particular month name inscribed in it, the pointer of the lower dial would also point to a cell that represented that same month. If that cell in the lower dial was blank, it indicated no eclipse was expected that month. If it had a glyph, the presence of sigma, shown here in this slide, stood for selene, the Greek word for moon, and indicated that a lunar eclipse was possible at the full moon in the middle of the month. The presence of an eta stood for Helios, the Greek word for sun, and indicated that a solar eclipse was possible at the end of the month at conjunction. And a combined solar and lunar glyph would signify a month with both possibilities. For either type of eclipse, sometimes the hour of day or night inscribed in the glyph would also indicate a predicted time of syzygy, with the word for hora, the Greek word for hour, indicated with this monogram of cursive omega and rho. The word day, hemera, abbreviated eta with mu over it, meant a lunar eclipse of the first Saros period was expected during the day, and the word for night, nuktos, abbreviated with nu and epsilon over it, meant the solar eclipse of the first Saros period was expected during the night. Now, it just so happens that after 223 lunar months, a similar eclipse happens, but it moves off an average of about 8 global hours. And since 8 hours is roughly 1/3 of a day, after 3 Saroi of 223 lunar months each, the same eclipse returns to roughly the same global region and roughly the same hour of the day. This more accurate period was discovered by the Babylonians, probably by the 3rd century BCE at the latest, and it was also known to the great Rhodian astronomer Hipparchus by around 140 BCE. The Greeks referred to this as the exeligmos, and in 2008, members of the AMRP announced that the mechanism also has a smaller dial pointed to here, known as the exeligmos dial, to keep track of this more accurate eclipse possibility period. If one had gone through more than one Saros period, the exeligmos dial would be pointing at either the 0 sector, nothing there, or the 8 sector, that stands for 8 hours, or the 16 sector, that stands for 16 hours, and this would indicate the number of hours, if any, the user needed to add to the glyph time to indicate the revised expected time of syzygy through successive Saros periods. Just to bring this closer to home, or at least to my home in Cleveland, Ohio, on March 7, 1970, a total solar eclipse known as Saros 139, number 27, ran up the east coast of the United States with the greatest eclipse at 1738 Universal Time. 18 years and 11 days later, or exactly 223 lunar months, on March 18, 1988, Saros 139, number 28, moved about 8 global hours west and ran through the Pacific, including through the Philippines, with the greatest eclipse at about 2 o'clock Universal Time, or about 8.5 hours later than the previous eclipse. You can see it more or less has the exact same shape. Then, exactly 223 lunar months later, on March 29, 2006, Saros 139, number 29, ran about another 8 global hours west through Africa and up through Turkey, with the greatest eclipse at 10:12 Universal Time, or about exactly 8 hours later. And on April 8th, 2024, exactly 223 months later, or 18 years and about 11 days, Saros cycle 139, number 30, went directly over Cleveland, and its greatest eclipse was at 1818 Universal Time, pretty close geographically and almost exactly the same hour as 3 Saroi periods before. The amazing thing is that the Babylonians and the makers of the mechanism knew this and were able to keep track of it. In the 2008 publication, the authors did not identify a precise set of historical eclipses, but after the 2008 publication, several groups of scholars were intensely interested in identifying the correct set of these eclipses, and some were also working on a text related to these that would later come to be known as the back plate inscription. At a meeting in Leiden in June of 2013, Christian Carmen and Jim Evans announced that they had identified the correct historical sequence, which they published the following year in 2014. Here they argued cell 1 of the Saros eclipse dial commenced with the month that began April 29, 205 BCE. Tony Freeth was in the audience in Leiden that day, and he was also working on this problem from a different angle, and in 2014, it was a very different angle, he also published his own article that also argued the startup date commenced with the lunar month, the same lunar month, beginning April 29, 205 BCE. And since then, in 2020, Alexander Jones has even done this via a third method. All of them come to the same conclusion. All right, using this information in 2017, I argued that while the Saros dial startup date was April 29, 205 BCE, the first day of the first month of the Metonic spiral, Phoenikaios, began on about August 24, 205 BC, and so 5 months later than the Saros. And Alexander Jones pointed out to me that this helps explain why the Exeligmos dial is rotated about 32 degrees, because if you start the Metonic down like this would have to, the dial of the Saros would have to start over here for these two to match up, and that's exactly that orientation of that dial right there. Now, some have taken this as evidence that the mechanism dates to about 205 BCE, and of course Archimedes and all that. But based on strands of historical evidence, such as when the Greeks first learned and employed the Saros period, it must date to Hipparchus or later. So it's very clear in our sources that Hipparchus is the first Greek who used the Babylonian material. He's also credited with being the first Greek to know that a lunar eclipse can happen after only 5 months, and we definitely have one place attested on the Saros where it's a 5-month difference. And so if sources like Pliny and Ptolemy are to be believed, it must date to Hipparchus and later. All right. My own preference is that it dates to around the time of the shipwreck, thus 70 to 60 BCE. And as Alexander Jones has argued, it may have been new cargo being delivered. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you just start off at the shipwreck at 60 BCE and you go back only 2 Calippic cycles of 76 years each, you're back at 205 BCE. You know, these are big astronomical periods and so forth. All right. There's been some controversy about the reading of some of the glyphs and the relation to what are called the index letters on the back plate inscription. I don't have time to cover all of that, but you can read about it in this 2019 article by Alexander Jones and me. Now I want to turn to the front of the mechanism. We take it for granted today that we have an accurate and consistent calendar that allows us to keep track of the best seasons, days for activities such as planting, pruning, harvesting, sailing, military campaigns, weather prediction, and medical problems, or to measure out precise terms of political offices. In particular, we have easily obtainable information about the days of the solstices and equinoxes. However, these require rather precise instruments, and meanwhile, the calendars of antiquity, and especially the variable lunar solar calendars of the Greeks, were not ideal for keeping track of each of such pivotal moments. Consequently, in addition to the solstices and equinoxes, they turned toward identifying a set repertoire of the phases of various asterisms, stars or clusters of stars or constellations, that were easily seen at dawn or dusk to help them determine the appropriate time of year for such activities. These phases include a particular asterism's morning, or heliacal, rising, its evening, or acronycal, setting, its evening rising, and its morning setting. Later, the Greeks, borrowing from the Babylonians, also kept track of the sun's entry into the 12 zodiacal signs to help organize and keep track of the tropical year. A next step in this tradition was to create a Parapegma, or a beside pegging, listing these various asterisms, a physical apparatus with peg holes standing for units of time, usually days, comprised of a repeating cycle of asterisms typically accompanied by inscribed text or pictorial displays describing the specific stages. Some of these were designed to be set up in the public square. The Parapegma inscriptions themselves are found on the front of the mechanism, both above and below the central two dials that dominate the front of it. I have circled them on the reconstruction here in red. Let me briefly explain how the zodiac dial worked in conjunction with the Parapegma inscription. All right, here the user would look at the zodiac dial and find an index letter at a particular degree within one of the zodiac signs, okay? In this example, I have circled the sector on the zodiac dial where it says Helai, which is the Greek word for the zodiac sign Libra, and the index letters Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, which are located at the 1st, 11th, 14th, and 16th degree of Libra. They would then take that index letter and go over to the Parapegma inscription and read off when it made its expected appearance or disappearance in the nighttime or early morning sky. There they would read, Helai arkantai epitelein, isimeria thinoporine alpha, which means Libra begins to rise, autumnal equinox alpha. And the alpha means 1 and is keyed, it means look at this 1 here on this dial. So from here, you could read off for the, down here is where you read off the autumnal equinox, you go to index letter 1, and you find it there. Okay, so this means that the autumnal equinox was the first stellar event of the year, and it happened at degree 1 of Libra, here down at, it's actually down here at the bottom at 180 degrees. The rest of the events were read in clockwise fashion. Okay, I won't go into all the details here, but I have some new readings of the index letters and inscription that help reconstruct it better. One of the current debates concerns the Egyptian calendar scale. In this slide, the purple represents what is known as the front plate, into which the zodiac dial is inscribed with the writing in green. And the red represents the Egyptian calendar dial, which has the names of the Egyptian months inscribed on it in yellow in my text, in a movable dial that sits in a kind of sink created in the front plate. Underneath, if I remove that, underneath that dial are holes for a pin that could function as a kind of parapegma, although they are almost certainly there to keep track of the wandering Egyptian calendar, which had only 365 days in it. One would expect, therefore, that the Egyptian calendar had 365 days and holes underneath it. But a group of researchers in 2020 who used some of the images and data supplied to them from the 2005 data have argued there is room for only 354 holes. That is the number of days for a lunar solar calendar. And they have received some support from another group who used the exact same data combined with techniques developed for gravitational wave astronomy. Let me just say that the idea that Greek astronomers would have used the Egyptian lunar calendar, which is very poorly attested, for astronomical purposes is highly unlikely. And their attempts to use measurements from such badly bent and damaged material is rather unsound. Greek astronomers, the only reason they used the Egyptian calendar because it was 365 days and regular, and they could keep track of the days. And there's no, and it's just all over the literature, and there's just no example of any being interested. And we have a lunar solar calendar on the back of the mechanism, so why not just use that one if you're going to use the lunar solar calendar? And the Egyptian lunar calendar actually is keyed to the civil calendar of 365 days, so that it doesn't even have really an independent function, all right? So, bad idea there. All right, finally, I'd like to cover the issue surrounding the front dials. In their 2006 publication, the AMRP, and in particular Tony Freeth there in the corner, published this version of the front dials. Basically, the front dials are dominated by two large concentric rings. The zodiac dial is the inner one, and the Egyptian calendar scale is the outer one. Within this, you have at least 3 pointers in his model. He's got 1, 2, 3 pointers. The first of which was the moon ball apparatus, that's preserved. And the second point, and then the pointers for the sun aren't preserved, but he puts in 2 pointers for the sun, one for the true sun with a golden sphere on it. And the pointer with the golden sphere is referenced on an inscription, so we know it's there. And a third pointer for the mean sun as well. And in this inscription and the back, which is describing the front dials, there's no room for a second pointer in the portion. I wish I had more time to go into how cool the moon ball is, which Michael Wright had identified in 2006, and which was probably painted half black and half white. The hole for it's still there, and the mechanism for it is there, but the ball itself is unfortunately missing. And the gearing tells us that it mimicked the phases of the moon. And not only that, but through a pin and slot device preserved, the mechanism was able to mimic the anomalous motion of the moon in accordance with Kepler's second law. All right, but I want to cover more of the issues of the front dials. Anyway, the AMRP left open the possibility that there may have been more displays for the planets, as Michael Wright had advocated in Reims long before, but there was no surviving epicyclic gearing for them. If they are there, if the gearing is there, it would need to have been located in the part of the mechanism that is lost between fragment A and fragment C, which you can see here in this picture with the red arrow. Many scholars after 2008 proposed such gear trains. In the meantime, Alexander Jones was working diligently for the AMRP, deciphering more of the inscriptions, and by 2011 he had ascertained that what are known as the front and back cover inscriptions mention all 5 visible planets as well as the term cosmos. This meant that the 2006, and it also, this inscription here, it talks about how the planets are moving forwards and then retrograde motion, and then they stop at a station, and it only makes sense if it's describing what you're seeing on the mechanism, all right? In a private email to Freeth, he suggested that the planets may have been embedded into concentric rings so that rather than the planets rotating on pointers, as is the case of the sun and the moon, the rings rotated and thus the planets along with them. We have many medieval manuscripts with such pictures and images of rings for the cosmos. Freeth felt at the time that such a design was not feasible mechanically, so in 2012, he and Jones published a new model of the mechanism showing the 5 planets rotating on pointers in a kind of portable cosmos, as in this diagram, which would require a robust set of lost epicyclic gearing between fragments A and C. After this, members of the AMRP published or republished all the major inscriptions of the mechanism in 2016, and these inscriptions established that without a doubt that what are known as the front cover inscription and the back cover inscription both referred to not only the sun and the moon, but also the 5 visible planets in antiquity, namely Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These texts also established that the theory behind the movements of the planets included epicycles, a theory best known from the works of the great astronomer Ptolemy, who worked around AD 150. But Ptolemy tells us that ascertaining the stations for this theory was demonstrated by the 3rd century BCE astronomer Apollonius of Pergae, and it is usually assumed he was the one who discovered it. Based on the text published in 2016, in 2021, Freeth et al. Then reversed course and worked out a very impressive mechanical model that uses rings rather than pointers. I have a few quibbles listed on the side here, and I wonder how well such a mechanical design would hold up under use, but it offers an interesting new solution. Actually, I just found out a few days ago that an Australian named Nick Andranis has made a working model that he takes after Freeth et al.'s 2021 gear work scheme. He uses that as his basis for his scheme. And although he seems to have pointers on this rather than rotating rings. So let me start this. Can't really, so here he's demonstrating it. You can't see it up close, but One can see that Kronos, Saturn, the little black sphere, does some retrograde motion. On the other hand, it seems strange to have the Earth at the center revolving around. He also, like Frias' model, has all these extra pointers for nodes and sun, and all those I think seem unnecessary to me. I would say that, to me, it seems like the front display is supposed to be a kind of work of art representing the cosmos, and so that any of these extra pointers that we might want in, like showing where the nodes are, which you can always get from the back of the inscription anyway, that we don't want those in there. There's no reference to them in the inscription. There's no evidence for them, and I think artistic and philosophic-wise, why put those in when you're trying to represent the cosmos? As for literary references to such devices, there may be an allusion to a planetarium as early as Aristotle, but the earliest unequivocal references are found in Cicero and date to about 50 BCE, right around the time of the shipwreck. In this first quote from Cicero's De Republica, written 54 to 51 BCE, there is the famous reference to orreries built by Archimedes of Syracuse. This is the earliest reference to those, that were taken as the spoils of war by Marcellus when he defeated them early in the year 211 BCE. The reference is problematic since it takes place as part of a fictional dialogue set in 129 BCE that reminisces about an event some 40 years earlier in 166 BCE. So Cicero's writing it in 51 to 54. It's a fictional dinner set in 129, and at this fictional dinner, they reminisce about an event from 166 when Marcellus pulls out one of these, okay? So, obviously the reference is problematic, but nonetheless, it provides evidence of such devices, possibly as far back as Archimedes. The second quote also comes from Cicero in his De Natura Deorum of 45 BCE. This passage has an explicit mention of an orrery built by the Stoic philosopher Posidonius of Apamea, who worked on roads, under whom Cicero studied Stoicism in 78 BCE. Here I should point out the connection, once again, with Rhodes, and that around the time of the shipwreck. I want to make clear, I don't want to associate the mechanism with Posidonius himself, as Rehm did, since it appears this is not a one-off thing, and there may have been a kind of industry on the island building these. And in addition, I recently realized that Cicero studies under Posidonius, and when Cicero is discussing the motions of the planets in a passage, and he uses the exact names that are on the inscription, like Ares Piroes and so forth, but he has them in a different order. He has Venus and Mercury reversed than they are on the mechanism, and that was another order in antiquity. And if Cicero is getting his information from Posidonius, which is likely, then that would mean that it can't be Posidonius's version, or it's a little bit later in Posidonius than 78 BCE, and Posidonius changed his mind. All right. Finally, to conclude, one naturally wants to understand the purpose of such mechanisms. In this mosaic of Roman times found at Pompeii, we see a group of philosophers sitting around a globe seen here in a wooden box. And another one down here in the corner. In this image and in the several literary sources that mention such devices, the primary function was educational and philosophical. That is, these mechanisms were built as a tour de force meditation upon the functioning of the cosmos. Another question is, why were they no longer made? There's nothing like this geared device for over another 1,000 years. One reason is that they were very labor intensive to build, requiring months of specialized labor. They also had a relatively short working life. They're made of high copper content bronze, it's very soft. They would have needed frequent repairs. They would have had backlash and very quickly could easily become a pile of junk. They also had very limited applications to elites who pondered the universe. Given this context and also the fact that much of astronomy by the Greeks and that inherited from the Babylonians also was rooted and grounded and tinged with religious astrology, it's not surprising that with the advent of Christianity, such devices no longer had a market. Okay, finally, I want to recognize all the folks in this slide here as being involved in helping create the extended reality image of the mechanism. I want to especially single out here in the center, Laursen Kubacki. She's the one that did all the marvelous artwork on the larger model that you're going to see. I also, James Gasparadis down here in the corner, he kept our group and especially me on schedule. And now I also want to thank Anna Faxon and Peter Gau again for coming all the way from Ohio to run the program, which we're going to look at in groups of 8 after I take questions. Thank you.